when life becomes an endless battle against yourself. Have you ever noticed how the harder you try to let go of something, the tighter it seems to grip you? Whether it's a painful memory, a toxic relationship, an unfulfilling job, or simply the anxiety that keeps you awake at night, the very act of trying to release it often feels like wrestling with shadows. You push, you pull, you strategize, you meditate, you read countless self-help books, yet somehow the thing you're trying to release seems to grow stronger, more persistent, more deeply rooted in your psyche. This struggle reveals something profound about the nature of human consciousness and the mechanics of true transformation. We've been taught that change requires effort, that liberation demands discipline, that freedom is something we must fight for. But what if this entire approach is fundamentally flawed? What if the very act of trying to let go is what keeps us bound? The question that emerges from this paradox cuts to the heart of human suffering. If trying harder doesn't work, if forcing ourselves to change only creates more resistance, then what does? How do we actually free ourselves from the patterns, beliefs, and circumstances that no longer serve us? The answer lies not in the realm of doing, but in the quality of seeing. There's a profound difference between understanding something intellectually and seeing it with such clarity that transformation becomes inevitable. When we truly see, not through the lens of our desires, fears, or conditioned responses, but with the pure light of awareness itself, liberation happens naturally, effortlessly, like autumn leaves falling from a tree. This article will explore the revolutionary understanding that true letting go isn't something we do, but something that happens when we learn to see clearly. We'll discover how this seeing dissolves the very foundation of what we're trying to release, making struggle unnecessary and transformation inevitable. The illusion of the struggler. Most of us live our entire lives believing we are separate from our experiences, that there's a me who has problems, a me who needs to change, a me who must work hard to become free. This fundamental misunderstanding creates the very struggle we're trying to escape from. We approach our fears, our limiting beliefs, our destructive patterns as if they were foreign invaders that must be defeated, rather than recognizing them as movements within our own consciousness. Consider how you relate to anxiety when it arises. The moment you feel that familiar tightening in your chest, that racing of thoughts, what happens? Immediately, there's a you who doesn't want to feel anxious, who begins strategizing how to make it go away. You might try breathing exercises, positive affirmations, or distraction techniques. But notice what's actually happening. You've created a war zone within yourself, with anxiety on one side and the anxiety fighter on the other. This division is the source of all psychological suffering. The moment we position ourselves as separate from our experience, we create conflict. The anxiety isn't the problem. The resistance to anxiety is. The fear isn't the issue. The fear of fear is. The painful memory isn't what torments us. Our relationship to that memory is. When we truly understand this, something remarkable happens. The entire framework of struggle begins to dissolve. We start to see that what we've been fighting against isn't an enemy at all, but simply another movement of consciousness, another wave in the ocean of awareness that we are. This doesn't mean we become passive or resigned. Rather, we discover a completely different way of relating to our experience. One that's based on understanding rather than opposition, on seeing rather than fighting. In this space of non-resistance, real transformation becomes possible. The ancient wisdom traditions have always pointed to this truth. What you resist persists, what you accept transforms. But acceptance here doesn't mean resignation or giving up. It means seeing so clearly that resistance becomes impossible. When you truly see a rope in the dim light, You don't have to work hard to stop being afraid of the snake. The fear simply disappears because its foundation has been removed. This is the secret of effortless letting go. It's not about forcing yourself to release anything, but about seeing so clearly that what you thought you needed to release was never actually there in the first place. The prison door was always open. You just couldn't see it through the fog of your own resistance. True seeing happens when the mind becomes still enough to perceive without the interference of desire or fear. It's not thinking about something or analyzing it. It's a direct, immediate recognition that bypasses the conceptual mind entirely. This seeing is like sunlight touching a shadow. The shadow doesn't struggle to disappear. It simply ceases to exist in the presence of light. When we apply this quality of seeing to our psychological patterns, something miraculous occurs. That limiting belief you've been trying to overcome for years suddenly reveals itself as nothing more than a thought you've been taking seriously. That toxic relationship you've been struggling to leave shows its true nature so clearly that walking away becomes as natural as stepping out of the rain. That addiction you've been battling transforms from a powerful force into a transparent mechanism that no longer has any hold over you. The beauty of this approach is that it requires no effort, no discipline, no gradual process of change. When seeing is complete, transformation is instantaneous. It's like the moment you realize you've been dreaming. You don't gradually wake up, you're simply awake. The dream and all its apparent problems vanish in an instant. Not because you fought them, but because you saw through their illusory nature. This is why all the techniques, strategies, and methods we use to try to change ourselves often fail. They're based on the assumption that there's something real that needs to be changed, rather than recognizing that what we're trying to change is often just a case of mistaken identity. Shadows we've mistaken for substance, thoughts we've confused with reality, patterns we've given more power than they actually possess. Practice, observing the mechanism of grasping and resistance. In the first week, begin by simply noticing when you're in resistance to something. This could be as obvious as being stuck in traffic and feeling frustrated, or as subtle as the slight tension you feel when someone disagrees with you. The key is not to try to stop the resistance, but to observe it with the same curiosity you might watch clouds forming in the sky. Notice how resistance feels in your body. The tightening, the bracing, the subtle or not so subtle preparation for battle. Observe how your mind immediately begins creating stories about why this experience shouldn't be happening, how it could be different, what needs to change. Watch this entire mechanism without trying to fix it or improve it. You're developing the capacity to see the process of resistance itself, which is the first step toward freedom from it. During the second week, expand your observation to include the stories you tell yourself about what you need to let go of. Perhaps you've identified that you need to release a grudge against someone, or let go of perfectionism, or stop being so anxious. Notice how even the idea of needing to let go creates a subtle form of resistance, a you who is something that must be released. Observe how this very framework keeps you locked in struggle. When you catch yourself thinking, I need to let go of this, pause and ask, who is the one who needs to let go? What exactly needs to be released? And who would be left if this letting go happened? Don't try to answer these questions intellectually, but let them work on you, creating space for a different kind of seeing to emerge. After 2 weeks of basic observation, begin to experiment with what happens when you stop trying to change or release anything at all. Choose one area of your life where you've been struggling to let go. Perhaps a relationship that ended, a career disappointment, or a persistent worry about the future. Instead of working on releasing it, simply be present with it exactly as it is. This doesn't mean wallowing or indulging in the story, but rather meeting the actual experience, the sensations in your body, the quality of energy, the movements of thought and emotion, with complete openness. Notice what happens when you stop positioning yourself as someone who needs to be free from this experience and instead allow yourself to be curious about what it actually is. The deepening of seeing. As your capacity for observation deepens, you'll begin to notice something extraordinary. The very act of seeing clearly, without agenda, begins to transform what you're seeing. It's as if your attention itself is a form of light that dissolves shadows simply by illuminating them. This isn't something you do deliberately. It happens naturally when seeing becomes pure enough. You might notice that a fear you've carried for years suddenly seems less solid, more transparent. A limiting belief that once felt like an unshakable truth begins to reveal itself as just another thought floating through awareness. This transformation isn't the result of effort or technique, but of the natural intelligence of consciousness recognizing its own creations. During this phase, pay particular attention to the moments when something you've been struggling with suddenly shifts or dissolves without any effort on your part. These spontaneous releases often happen when you're not trying to make them happen, perhaps while you're walking in nature, taking a shower, or in the quiet moments before sleep. Notice that these shifts don't come from doing something right, but from a quality of openness and presence that allows what's ready to be released to fall away naturally. This is the intelligence of the system working on itself, like a tree naturally shedding its leaves when the season changes. Recognizing the illusion of the problem. As your seeing becomes more refined, you may begin to recognize that many of the things you thought you needed to let go of were never actually problems in the first place. What you took to be a solid, persistent issue was often just a collection of thoughts, sensations, and stories that you had woven together into something that seemed real and problematic. This recognition can be startling. You might find yourself laughing at how seriously you took something that now appears obviously insubstantial. This doesn't mean your suffering wasn't real or that your struggles don't matter. Rather, you begin to see that suffering comes not from circumstances themselves, but from the way consciousness relates to circumstances. A painful emotion, for instance, isn't inherently problematic. It becomes a problem only when there's resistance to it, when there's a story that it shouldn't be there, when there's an identity that feels threatened by its presence. When this resistance dissolves through clear seeing, the emotion can move through awareness like weather moving through sky. Natural, temporary, and ultimately harmless. Living from clarity. The ultimate fruit of this practice is not the ability to let go of things, but the recognition that there was never anything to hold on to in the first place. You begin to live from a place of natural flow, where experiences arise and pass away without creating the psychological residue that once seemed to accumulate and require release. This doesn't make you passive or indifferent. If anything, you become more responsive, more alive, more capable of appropriate action. But the action comes from clarity rather than compulsion, from love rather than fear, from understanding rather than reaction. In this state, letting go becomes as natural as breathing. You don't have to work at releasing things because you're no longer grasping them in the first place. Challenges still arise, difficulties still occur, but they move through your experience like wine through an open window. There's nothing solid for them to stick to, no resistance for them to build up against. You discover that what you always thought was strength, the ability to hold on, to maintain, to control, was actually a form of weakness, and that true strength lies in the capacity to remain open, present, and responsive to whatever life brings. The paradox of effortless effort. This practice might seem paradoxical. You're making an effort to not make effort, working to stop working, trying to stop trying. This paradox is inherent in any practice that points toward the natural state of being. Initially, some effort is required to establish new patterns of attention and awareness. But this effort is different from the effortful struggle of trying to change yourself. It's more like the effort of learning to relax. You have to consciously let go until letting go becomes natural and unconscious. The key is to hold this practice lightly, without making it another project for self-improvement or another way to achieve some future state of freedom. The moment you turn into a technique for getting somewhere else, you've missed the point entirely. The freedom you're seeking isn't in some future moment when you've successfully let go of everything. It's available right now, in this very moment, in the simple act of seeing clearly what's actually here. Remember that this seeing isn't something you possess or develop like skill. It's more like remembering something you've always known, like recognizing your own face in a mirror. The capacity for clear seeing is inherent in consciousness itself. You're not creating it. You're simply removing the obstacles that obscure it. These obstacles are nothing more than habits of attention, patterns of thinking, and identities you've mistaken for yourself. When these are seen clearly, they lose their power to obstruct the natural clarity of awareness, the natural intelligence of release. What emerges from this understanding is a profound trust in the natural intelligence of consciousness itself. Just as your body knows how to heal a cut without your conscious intervention, awareness knows how to release what no longer serves without your effortful assistance. This intelligence is always operating, always seeking balance, always moving toward greater harmony and integration. When we stop interfering with this process through our attempts to control and manage our experience, we discover that life has its own wisdom, its own timing, its own perfect unfolding. This doesn't mean we become passive or stop taking appropriate action in our lives. Rather, our actions begin to flow from a different source, from clarity rather than confusion, from love rather than fear, from understanding rather than compulsion. We learn to distinguish between the actions that arise naturally from seeing clearly and the reactive behaviors that come from resistance and struggle. The former feel effortless even when they require energy. The latter feel effortful even when they accomplish nothing. True letting go, then, is not something we do, but something we allow. It's the natural result of seeing so clearly that holding on becomes impossible, like trying to grasp water or hold on to a cloud. When we truly see the nature of what we're attempting to possess or control, the very attempt reveals its own futility. In that recognition, release happens by itself, not as a loss or a giving up, but as a return to our natural state of openness and flow. This is the ultimate freedom, not the freedom to get what we want or to avoid what we don't want, but the freedom to be present with whatever arises without the compulsive need to change it, fix it, or escape from it. In this presence, we discover that what we always thought was the problem was actually just life being life, consciousness being consciousness, the natural flow of existence expressing itself through the temporary form that we are. When we stop fighting this flow, we don't disappear or become nothing. We become everything. We discover that what we thought was our individual self struggling against the world was actually the world experiencing itself through the lens of apparent separation. In the recognition of this truth, the struggle ends not because we've won or lost, but because we've seen through the illusion that there was ever a battle to be fought.